Okay, can we start? Oh.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this next session, Jewish Soldiers Through a Cultural Lens. Our distinguished panel will explore the ways in which Jewish fighters were commemorated, how their role and courage on the battlefront was reimagined, and how cultural preconceptions of loyalty and cowardice shaped their portrayal. Please welcome Evgeny Finkel of Johns Hopkins University, who will serve as moderator and introduce our panel today. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Hello, thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone. This is our fourth session of this conference, Jewish Soldiers Through a Cultural Lens. And our first speaker is Dr. Marilyn Campeau, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center of Holocaust Studies at Leibniz Institute for Contemporary History in Munich. She is a historian of the Second World War and the Holocaust in the Soviet Union, and her doctoral dissertation compares drawings created by on-duty Soviet soldiers in the Red Army during the war along with state-sponsored visual sources, including photographs, caricatures, and other newspaper materials. And as a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Holocaust Studies, she conducts research for her project Facing Europe, Soviet Soldiers in Germany, 1945-1994, which follows Soviet troops as they traveled on occupied Central Europe during the post-war period. Her research interests stand at the crossroads of the study of everyday life, war, society, visual culture, gender, Holocaust, and genocide study with a special focus on the history of the USSR. So Marilyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so I will share my screen now. Would you be able to see my presentation?
Yes, wonderful.
Beautiful. Okay. Well, thank you for this introduction. And I also want to thank the organizer for inviting me. I'm actually quite excited to be here today. So yeah, this paper is based on the research that I conducted for my dissertation, which, as was said, is based on an analysis of frontline drawings of Red Army soldiers. It's also based on the work I just completed working with the collection, the Evgeny Finkel photo collection, held at the Picker Art Gallery at Colgate University. And it also hints to a future chapter that I'm hoping to add to my dissertation as I transform it into a book, which would look at the aftermath of like what happened to those drawings after the war. Many of those drawings are actually were made by Soviet Jewish soldiers. So as we already mentioned earlier in this conference, about 500,000 Jews were in the Red Army during World War II, and along with the 10 million others, Soviet soldiers, Jewish combatants fulfilled their duty to the nation, participating in the defense of the Soviet territory against the German invader. And the work of David Shrayer has stressed the important role played by Soviet Jewish war photographers, 50% of which were Jews. However, little is known about the Soviet Jewish frontline artists who recorded their war journey with the help of a pencil and paper. So this paper aimed to stress the important contribution of these Soviet Jews in the Red Army as producer of visual culture during and after the war. An examination of their artwork shed lights on how frontline artists used their drawings to document both small and larger events on the front line. They documented also the encounter with the evidence of the Holocaust. And I discussed how this image played a central role in the building during, as the war unfolded, but also after 1945, of this narrative about the war and about the Holocaust. So as I said, David Shrayer has discussed many of those Soviet Jews behind the camera. And among them, the most famous one remained Evgeny Finkel, who gifted the world with this well-known photograph of the staging of the hoisting of the Soviet flag on the Reichstag, but also images of Soviet soldiers' encounter with the evidence of the Holocaust. even representation of daily life in the Red Army that Haldane captured with his camera, like the photo we see here in the middle, showing a field kitchen, also convey the desire of revenge that soldiers had as they crossed Austria in 1945, who set on fire the image that the house that you actually see in the background, which, according to the story, belonged to a concentration camp commandant. Later in interviews, Haldane himself claimed that he saw his camera as much as a tool of revenge as of documentation. And this desire to document was shared by those Soviet Jewish artist combatants who drew on the front line. Their drawing allowed them to document daily life on the front lines, but also those extraordinary historical events in which they participated in. The image they produce on the front line reveal how they developed an historical consciousness during the war, but also use these like their visual art to insert themselves in history. For example, we see here the drawings made by the Soviet Jewish military artist Naum Moiseyevich Lysogorsky. So he graduated from art school as a painter in Odessa and worked before the war as a caricaturist. And throughout the war, he remained on the front, and he drew for like military newspaper and also for himself. And in the rank of the 64th Army around the city of Stalingrad, he drew in late 1942 the appearance of a dugout, which is the image you see below. And like it was some sort of moment of calm, and he wanted to like kind of have this proof, like a visual testimony of the space where, you know, the artist was at this specific moment. And even more significant, I believe, is the drawing he made on the 3rd of February 1943, which, like the first one you see isn't actually in the middle, is this room with a desk, a chair, a small wooden stove. And without the context provided by the caption, this drawing appears insignificant. However, the artist noted that the drawing was made in the basement where the German Field Marshal Paulus had been, taken prisoner, stressing how it symbolized the important victory over the Sixth Army in the city. As an experienced artist, Lysogorsky realized soon the limitation of his drawing, and the day after, he made a second drawing of the same room in which he inserted 3 Soviet combatants, finding a bottle of alcohol in the drawer of the dress. And in inserting his comrade in arms into the frame, Lysogorsky defined himself as this witness to this historical event. And both men and women, Soviet Jews in the Red Army, got involved in that production of visual art on the front line. For example, here we see drawings made by Leah Vladimirovna Hinstein. She was born in 1941, she was studying art in Moscow at the outbreak of the war. And so she enrolled, and by early 1942, she joined Air Defense Division, and she participated in a different campaign, among them like the Southwestern Front from the Soviet perspective. And so the drawing, the first one we see here, Letters to Home, was made in February 1944, and is this, it's an insider perspective on the intense friendship that a female fighter had on the front line. It shows a semicircle of 4 women in uniform sitting close to each other, writing letters around that small table. And the other drawing, rather than looking at daily life, look at extraordinary event, but in a very original way. So this drawing shows people looking at the window, but we don't see what they look at, which is actually the victory parade. So it's, again, an original way to mark the end of the war that the artist witnessed in Lviv in May 1945. Again, the drawing proving her involvement in this significant event. So those artists on the front, both Jewish and non-Jewish, also use their drawings to represent their encounter with the evidence of the Holocaust. For example, Georgy Stepanovich Melikhov, the drawings we see here, was created by him. He was born in Kharkiv. He studied art in Ukraine. And during the war, he was in the active service, first as working in a road building battalion. And so he visited Majdanek right when the Soviet troops entered the site. And he recalled, quote, "I saw Majdanek on July 25th, 1944, half an hour after the fascists left it." He continues, "I saw the oven, which burned corpse, leg sticking out of the ovens. I saw the terrible, brutal, real machinery of death," end quote. So following this experience, he created that drawing, which meticulously replicates how the space was arranged around the crematorium. And without sparing any detail, Melikhov depicted like the oven with the door left opened, built on that elevated structure, overlooking the skeleton of the victims. And this drawing is dated from September 1944. So it's plausible that he did a couple of sketches when he was on site, but finished the drawing using photographs and film footage that was available at the time. Like one of the images actually there for you to see, the parallels. And the Soviet soldiers that Melikhov inserted as a central figure in the frame reveals another goal of the drawing. It represents this average Red Army fighter, both as a witness of the German atrocity, but also as a liberator of the people who suffered under the occupation. The figure of the soldier here act as a conductive thread between the oven and the pile of skull that he, as a spectator and savior, oversees from his higher position. And the focus on the men, like here, the focus is on the men witnessing the traces of atrocity committed, not on the people who had been targeted by the Germans. And the focus on the Soviet soldiers as liberators in those Soviet Jewish artist combatants art piece reinforced the idea that Jews were not only victims, but also saviors of their own people. At the same time, not all Soviet Jews who drew on the front made clear in their drawings that Jews were the main target of the Germans. For example, like when we see the first two drawings are made by Zinovy Shenderovich Tolkachov, who was a Jewish Belarusian Red Army painter who participated both in the liberation of Majdanek and Auschwitz. And so he produced images that emphasize both the role of Soviet soldiers as liberator, but also of the Jewishness of the victims. He represented the talit katan, like attached to the barbed wire, where the four fringe garment appears like flying in the wind as a flag, as a Jewish flag, symbolizing the Jews who died there. By contrast, Lysogorsky, here it's more like a poster that would be used for propaganda, entitled "They Wait for the Liberation from the German Yoke," places those crying young women who do not look stereotypically Jewish. They look pale, they have pale eyes, but they are at the forefront, and they are labeled as Soviet with the badge Ost, like Ostarbeiter, which is on their uniform, to present them as Russian, Ukrainians, or ethnic Poles that were forcibly sent to the West to work for the enemy. So those images both build on the Soviet liberators' conception of, that the occupiers could and did victimize Jews, as well as the population, the Soviet population at large. And Lysogorsky probably chose to present his victim as Slavic or native to facilitate the publication of his artwork, because a general appeal to rescue was the Soviet policy for visual propaganda at the time. And as a visual cultural producer, Soviet Jews in the Red Army had an impact on the building of the Soviet war narrative, and they used this opportunity to integrate Jewish combatants, or at least stress their presence in the story. With their photographs and with their drawings, they immortalized the participation of Jews in the fight against Nazi Germany. For example, the famous portrait of the female partisan Sarah Geneite at the liberation of Vilna in 1944 was taken by a Jewish Soviet mayor, Yasha Ryumkin, who was surprised to see a female among Jewish partisans that were standing guard. And as for portraits of fighters that were made with paper and pencil, it is often difficult to actually identify who is in it and who is actually Jewish, because most of the portraits or the subjects in the portraits were actually not identified by name. However, the self-portraits that Jewish artists made of themselves during the war somewhat fill that gap, I believe. For example, like we see here, the portrait of and made by Ilya Davidovich Kryczewski, who was born in northern Ukraine, studied in Ukraine and like art in Ukraine and in Russia before the war, and reached the front line like right after the outbreak, 3 days after the beginning of the war, first as a sapper, and then he became an artist on the front line later. And in 1945, he drew himself with this serious look, wearing a military tunic and a side cap, smoking the pipe. And this drawing acts, again, as a proof of his time in uniform and his personal contribution as a fighter, a contribution to Soviet society. So the important contribution of Soviet Jewish Red Army artists to the Soviet war visual culture did not stop after the war. And they also participated in the process of memorialization of the war in the Soviet Union. To give only one example, the publication, I Went Through That War, which is, like, I reproduced the first issue here, but there's actually 10 issues published between 1979 and 1987, which focus on the work about the war made by a Soviet artist war participant. And out of the 212 artists in the series, between 11 and 15% bear Jewish names. It appeared clear that the involvement of Jewish artists as war cultural producer did not stop after the victory of May 1945. And in my future research, I really hope to further investigate how the work of Jewish artists in the post-war period shaped the Soviet narrative. More broadly, I want to address the issue of how art representing the Great Patriotic War went through a process of fossilization, which pressured and continued to pressure contemporary artists to make artwork that blends in the style of original wartime creations, and also overall evaluating how soldier drawings both strengthen and challenge the state narrative of the war and of the Holocaust. I'm done with my time, so I'm going to stop here. I want to thank you in advance for your questions and comments.
Thank you. Thanks, Marilyn. So let's wait until you finish sharing. Are we back to the main screen? Yes, wonderful. Thank you. And our next speaker is Professor Maxim D. Shrayer, who is a professor of Russian, English, and Jewish Studies at Boston College. He is also a prolific author and a translator. He was born in Moscow and grew up as a refusenik. He is an author and an editor of over 15 books in English and Russian, among them Leaving Russia, A Jewish Story, and Waiting for America, and also a story collection, Yom Kippur in Amsterdam, and most recently, very timely, a poetry collection of Politics and Pandemics, Songs of the Russian Immigrant. His work won a 2007 National Jewish Book Award, and he is a 2012 recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship. His work has been translated into 10 languages, and you can learn more about his writing and follow his work on the website or on Twitter. Both are listed on his bio at the conference website. So, Maxim, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much. I'm grateful for this opportunity to be part of this conference. As most ex-Soviet Jews of my age, I have my own Jewish soldiers among the generation of grandparents. So I hope you'll forgive me this flight of sentimentalism, as I remember one of them, my late paternal grandfather, Pesach Piotr Shrayer. He volunteered for the Finnish campaign. Soon after the Nazi invasion, he volunteered again and served at the Leningrad front and then at the Baltic Fleet, ending his frontline service as lieutenant commander at Königsberg in April 1945. In this photo, taken in late 1942, he's a 33-year-old captain. And now my main story, at the heart of which lies the struggle of a Jewish poet soldier to preserve and publicize his account of the first trial of Nazi collaborators. The trial took place in the southern Russian city of Krasnodar, formerly Ekaterinodar, on the 14th, 18th July 1943. At the 1943 Krasnodar trial, 15 Nazis were named by the prosecution. Those included the commander of Sonderkommando 10A, SS Sturmbannführer Dr. Kurt Chrisman, who was actually subsequently tried in Munich in 1980. However, 11 Soviet citizens stood trial, 10 of them ethnic Russians and Ukrainians, 1 an ethnic Adige, 5 were natives of the Krasnodar region. Most of them had been auxiliaries of Sonderkommando 10A of Einsatzgruppe D. 8 were sentenced to death by hanging and 3 to 20 years of hard labor. About 30,000 people watched the public execution in Krasnodar's main square, and the hanging was captured in the short documentary Приговор народа, The Verdict of the People, released in August 1943. The Krasnodar trial cast a shadow over subsequent trials of Nazis and Nazi accomplices in the USSR and over the international and national tribunals of post-war justice. It was a carefully orchestrated performance, with the accused confessing their crimes, but forgetting about the identity of those whom their crimes had principally targeted, with members of the audience, most of whom had just recently looked the other way as their Jewish neighbors were being annihilated, now donning expressions of hatred for the 11 sitting in the dock under armed guard. Stalin took a special interest in the preparation of the trial. Besides Molotov, Vyshinsky, and state prosecutor Bachkov, Stalin's Krasnodar trial team included Georgy Alexandrov, head of the Directorate of Agitation and Propaganda of the party's Central Committee and one of the architects of the official Soviet rhetoric of non-specifying Jewish death and wartime valor. The Krasnodar trial gave form and expression to the Stalinist doctrine of obfuscating Jewish victimhood, having crystallized in the spring of 1943 between Stalingrad and Kursk. Some background is in order. In the summer and autumn of 1941, large numbers of civilians were evacuated to the Krasnodar region. More were evacuated in the spring and summer of 1942, especially from Crimea, Rostov province, and Leningrad province. During the occupation of the Krasnodar region in August through February 1943, between 18,000 and 27,000 Jews were murdered in the region's 65 cities, towns, stanitsas, and villages. These are the main parameters of the Shoah in the Krasnodar region. 75% of the Jewish victims were killed within the first 2 months of the occupation. The victims included a high proportion of Jewish children, mainly evacuees, among them wards of orphanages. Simultaneously with Jews, all Karaites, Karaims, were murdered. And finally, there was a wide range of gas vans known in Russian as dushegubki. The writer handpicked by Stalin's leadership to report on the trial was Alexey Tolstoy, scion of an old Russian aristocratic family who became one of the preeminent Soviet authors and a venal Stalinist. In November 1942, he became a member of the Extraordinary State Commission, ЧГК. The timing was, of course, challenging for the trial's propagandistic purposes. On the 12th of July, 1943, 2 days prior to the opening of the trial, Red Army forces had commenced Operation Kutuzov, aimed at the defeat of the Nazi troops at the Oryol salient. In this connection, note the absence of Konstantin Simonov at the trial. Stalin's favorite, Simonov had replaced Vasily Grossman as the lead Red Star correspondent at Stalingrad, and in the summer of 1943 was at the height of his wartime popularity. The other courtroom reporters for the Central Press wore rank and file horses of Soviet journalism. The coverage was unremarkable, except for the gripping photos of exhumed bodies. In fact, it wasn't until December 1943 that the big three of wartime journalism and anti-Nazi propaganda, Tolstoy, Simonov, and Ehrenburg, would be dispatched to Kharkov, where 3 Nazi officers and a collaborator would stand trial. Besides Alexey Tolstoy, the other famous writer present at the Krasnodar trial was Ilya Sylvinsky, descendant of Ashkenazi Jews and Krimchaks, a poetic virtuoso. A frontline military journalist, in January-February 1942, Sylvinsky had been the first national poetic witness to the annihilation of Jews by Nazis in the occupied territories. By the summer of 1943, Sylvinsky had run into major trouble with Stalin's leadership. Sylvinsky's experience as a witness to the liberation of Krasnodar differed drastically from his experience at Kerch in early January 1942. Back then, he arrived within a week of the start of the Kerch-Feodosia landing operation. West of Kerch, Sylvinsky saw the Bagirova anti-tank ditch filled to the brim with the bodies of Jewish people, mainly women, children, and elderly. The sight of this open-air morgue changed Sylvinsky's life and informed the creation in 1942 of 2 major Shoah poems. Did Sylvinsky see the aftermath of Nazi genocidal atrocities during the liberation of the Krasnodar region? Sylvinsky's diary for the spring and summer of 1943 contains no mention of Jewish victimhood. Sylvinsky came to the trial as a writer for the main newspaper of the North Caucasus Front. Literally 1 day prior to the opening, a denunciatory anonymous article against him appeared in Izvestia. Sylvinsky was often seated with Tolstoy, and yet he was not mentioned in the coverage of the trial. He appears in the raw footage, but was cut out of the documentary released after the trial. Sylvinsky published no reports in his frontline newspaper Vperyod k Pobede, Forward to Victory, or elsewhere. As the government-chosen reporter, Tolstoy did not end up writing anything about the Krasnodar trial, which is actually a big mystery. Tolstoy did write Korичневый Durman, Brown Madness, a long essay, later published as a pamphlet about the Nazi atrocities in North Caucasus, which ran in most Soviet newspapers on the 5th of August, 1943. Tolstoy described atrocities across the Stavropol region. The word Jew and cognates appeared 13 times in Tolstoy's essay. In September-October 1943, while stationed in the Kuban Cossack town of Temryuk, Sylvinsky composed the poem Sud v Krasnodare, the trial at Krasnodar. The basic structure of the poem survived throughout its 3 known rounds of revisions, while some of its elements and optics changed. At the heart of the poem lies the interrogation of one of the accused, Richkalov, followed by the testimony of one Kotov, a survivor who identifies Richkalov as one of the operators of a gas van. In the original text, Sylvinsky's authorial character sits next to Tolstoy, whose remarks and body language indicate that he doubts Richkalov's culpability. Sylvinsky's poem culminates with the scene of the public execution and an ensuing argument between Sylvinsky and Tolstoy. Sylvinsky agonized over the execution scene, as evident from the original and the subsequent versions. Note especially the crossed out line, "Под грохот оскорбительных оваций," to the thunder of insulting ovations, which speaks to the ugliness of this Soviet public performance. Sylvinsky ended the poem with a confrontation which had its roots in his experience as a witness to the Shoah in his native Crimea. I'm deliberately offering a very literal English translation. "Do you feel sorry for them?" Tolstoy asked me. "Not really, just curious." "You lie. And you, Alyosha, have you seen in Kerch 7,000 corpses?" "No, I haven't." 7. There were children, women, handicapped. It's possible these very ones shot them. One, I remember, was an old woman, and one just like the Madonna with the child Jesus. Now, for them, I feel sorry. I see. Besides, as a military officer, you must develop a certain sternness, or in the very least, a habit. My dear, I understand you very well. I very much. Which way are you going? Straight. Be well. Good night. Within less than 2 months after the composition of the trial at Krasnodar, Sylvinsky was summoned to Moscow, brought to appear at the Org Bureau of the Central Committee, and made a persona non grata of Soviet culture. Sylvinsky became the target of 3 party resolutions. This is an all-time record, wartime record, including one singularly vilifying his wartime poetry. He was punitively discharged from the military and blacklisted in his military papers. The period is euphemistically described as reservist. By the late spring of 1945, when Sylvinsky was finally permitted to return to the army, a number of factors central to our story had changed. 1, in 1944, following the shakeup in the leadership of Fig journals, Всеволод Vishnevsky was reappointed as editor of the Moscow monthly Znamya, Banner. Author of Optimistic Tragedy, arguably the only officially billed Soviet tragedy, Vishnevsky spent over 2 years in the besieged Leningrad, heading the writers' group attached to the Baltic Fleet. Vishnevsky made Banner the principal Russian language venue for Shoah-related materials, among them poetry by Sylvinsky and Antokolsky, and nonfiction by Grossman, Antokolsky, and Kaverin, most notably Grossman's The Hell of Treblinka. 2, Alexey Tolstoy died of lung cancer in February 1945 and was given a state funeral. Sylvinsky, who, unlike Simonov or Vishnevsky, was never promoted to full colonel, in other words, he remained lieutenant colonel, Sylvinsky returned to Moscow from the Baltics in the summer of 1945 and submitted a revised text of the trial at Krasnodar to Banner. Tolstoy still appeared in the text, as did a variant of the execution scene and a discordant ending, to which Sylvinsky added important dimensions. 3 members of Banner's editorial board prepared readers' reports on Sylvinsky's poem. All 3 asked that the execution scene be cut. Simonov's report is the most articulate. I quote, this is Simonov's reader's report. The poem is good and powerful, except, of course, we should not even consider keeping the scene of the hanging. It's not in the traditions of Russian literature to describe this, and it is not in the traditions of Russian journalism to print this. Sylvinsky's report blatantly disregarded foundational texts of classical and early 20th century Russian literature and conflated the Russian historical debates about capital punishment as such and about public versus private execution. A short list would include works of narrative poetry and prose by Pushkin, Lermontov, Gogol, Turgenev, and Dostoevsky. I'm happy to comment on that later if we have time. A close examination of the next round of revisions shows that Sylvinsky was prepared to forego the depiction of Alexei Tolstoy. In obliterating Tolstoy, Sylvinsky replaced him with N.N., a foreign journalist. It's
Maxim,
right
2 minutes.
Yeah, a foreign journalist. This foreign journalist now continues to doubt the culpability of the accused and also is showing what he refers to as Christian mercy. And there's reason to believe that in transforming the real historical Tolstoy into N.N., who is a foreign correspondent, Sylvinsky was informed by the experience of Alexander Wirth, who was a BBC correspondent and who was present at the Krasnodar trial and who later referred to it in his famous memoir as largely a work of Soviet propaganda. Be it as it may, Sylvinsky fought tooth and nail to preserve the execution scene, and he was pressured. He was pressured continuously. The last time he was pressured was on the 29th of October, 1945, when the entire editorial board wrote a letter to him, pleading with him. We do not know exactly what happened. The poem was slated to appear in the November 1945 issue, and what we do know that the execution scene was probably cut sometime between the galleys and the publication. I'm going to now move to the conclusion, which talks about the version that appeared. in the version that appeared, we have the following dialogue that survives from the earlier versions, where Sylvinsky continues to refer to what he saw at Kerch, the first, or some of the earliest Holocaust witness evidence, and then he says this in answering to this foreign journalist. The foreign journalist says, "Yet, don't you agree? These ones are already dead, but these are alive. As a Christian, I must now feel sorry for these ones." And Sylvinsky goes on to describe this incredible pain that he's overcome to. And he says to this foreign correspondent, who refers to himself as one possessing Christian mercy, to the accused, "Go away. Thank God that nobody heard your last phrase. Your hotel, the second block, and on the right. Go now. I feel very sorry for your Christ." So in closing, I want to say three things. One of them, of course, the ending can be read both Sovietly and Jewishly, but I think Sylvinsky multiply underscores the Jewish perspective. Two, a little bit about the mystery of the poem's legacy. It appears virtually unchanged from the Banner magazine publication in Sylvinsky's collection of 1947, but after that, it has not been reprinted to this day. Two, a wave of subsequent Soviet trials of Nazis and collaborators follows, each ending with a carefully orchestrated public execution: the Kharkov trial, the Kiev trial, the Leningrad trial, the Minsk trial, etc. And two odd bits to reflect on. One is that Vishnevsky, the one who published the record number of Holocaust works in Znamya, including this poem, was removed from his post and replaced with a hardline of Vadim Kozhevnikov, the very one who would later take Grossman's Жизнь и судьба, Life and Fate, to the KGB. And two, that even today, when the internet is rife with all sorts of nonsense and all sorts of valuable materials, you cannot find the text of Sylvinsky's A Trial at Krasnodar ever. And that, to me, is one of the mysteries of its legacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxim. So before we move to our third presentation, I remind everyone to submit your questions to the Q&A. And our final speaker for this panel is Professor Elissa Bemporad, who is a professor of history and Unger Chair in East European Jewish History and the Holocaust at Queen's College and CUNY Graduate Center. She is a 2 times winner of the National Jewish Book Award for her books Becoming Soviet Jews, The Bolshevik Experiment in Minsk, published by Indiana University Press, and the much more recent Legacy of Blood, Jews, Pogroms, and Ritual Murder in the Lands of the Soviets, published in 2019 by Oxford. She is also a co-editor of 2 volumes, Women and Genocide, Survivors, Victims, and Perpetrators, and Pogroms, a documentary history, which is hot off the presses with Oxford University Press, and she is currently completing the first volume of Comprehensive History of Soviet Jews, forthcoming with NYU University Press, and works on a biography of Esther Fromkin. She is also the editor of the journal Jewish Social Studies. So, Elissa, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Let me start by thanking the sponsors, Blavatnik and Genesis in particular. I want to thank every single one of you for being here. And I want to thank Evgeny for a generous introduction. I'm going to be very original and I'm not going to show a PowerPoint. So this is what I want to do in the next 15 minutes. First, I want to remind us of the resurgence of popular anti-Semitism after 1941. If during the interwar period, the Soviet system had suppressed it by force, the exposure to relentless, exterminatory, anti-Semitic rhetoric and practices under the Germans inevitably bolstered anti-Semitism in the Soviet context, and a new synergy between anti-Jewish sentiments from below and the response or lack thereof from above by Soviet authorities at the local, regional, and central level became the rule and not the exception. In particular, the revival of the Judeo-Bolshevik myth under German occupation and assumptions of the Jews' ability to access unlimited power came to validate assumptions of a disruptive and disloyal force. Second, I will explore some of the ways in which Jewish soldiers and veterans attempted to counter anti-Semitism through words, in letters or petitions to the authorities, or through actions, sometimes even taking the law into their own hands. Of course, the nature of the response to anti-Semitism varied according to the geographical location and to the time factor, whether it took place at the beginning of the war, 1942-43, or after the war. These responses, as diverse as they are, cover a wide gamut of emotions ranging from confusion, disbelief, despair, grief, and rage, as Soviet Jewish soldiers tried to make sense of anti-Semitism and their place in Soviet society. In order to introduce both these themes, anti-Semitism and the responses of Jewish soldiers, let me begin with the perspective of an outsider, a Polish Jew by the name of Yitzhak Erlichson, who was 19 years old when in 1939 he left his hometown in the Kielce province and fled to the Soviet Union to escape the Nazis. As he recounts in his remarkable memoirs, together with millions of others, he was evacuated towards the Russian interior in the winter of 1941. And here he encountered anti-Semitism. He took note with great dismay of the comments made by other Jewish refugees who he met on the way and who confirmed this novelty with shock. Quote, "Some whispered that the approach of the Nazi troops had brought to the surface the anti-Semitism among the Russian people, which had been suppressed by fear of the NKVD," end quote. They referred here to what had been during the 1920s and 30s a Soviet commitment, at least on paper, to condemn and stomp out anti-Semitism. As the young Polish Jew reached the Novosibirsk train station on his way to Chelyabinsk, he met another group of Jewish refugees sitting dejectedly with their poor belongings. He noticed a sense of defeat in their demeanor. They were surrounded by a group of Russians who openly remarked that Hitler's columns were marching deep into their land, liberating more and more territory. According to Erlichson, they pronounced the word liberating with great satisfaction to convey, he thought, their resentment toward the Soviet government. And in order to do so, they criticized the Jews. Quote, "They cursed and insulted the Jews, and their anger against the Jews replaced their anger at the NKVD, the authorities, the entire Soviet system," end quote. In many places, the local population came to see the German occupation as a dual liberation from Jews and Bolsheviks. The Germans deliberately revived anti-Bolshevik sentiment via anti-Jewish propaganda to arouse or validate hostility towards the Jews by identifying them with Soviet power and vice versa, reinforcing ideas of Jewish disloyalty both toward the different ethno-nationalities, but also toward the supranational Soviet people. I would be showing you here an image, but unfortunately I can't. But it is an amateur drawing made in 1941 in November by a Ukrainian worker who depicted Stalin holding a knife in his hand and surrounded by hundreds of skulls. The inspiration for this art was most likely from the well-known anti-Bolshevik depictions from the Civil War of Leon Trotsky, also surrounded by a sea of skulls and bones, and I imagine that you have that in mind. Here, the worker portrayed the Soviet leader toiling on behalf of the bloodthirsty Jew. And the text that was written says, "Stalin is the bloody enemy of the people who brought destruction to the whole world. A sea of blood flows from the people in the name of the regime of the Jews and the communists. Stalin is the hireling of the Jews. Stalin is the bloody enemy of the people." Calls to resist Jewish rule were intercepted by the Soviet secret police during the 20s and 30s. Including calls for anti-Jewish violence in order to take revenge against collectivization and industrialization against Jews as the main beneficiaries of the October Revolution, holders of the best positions and jobs, owners of the best apartments, and accomplished draft dodgers. A worker in Odessa, for example, noted in 1932 that one can now observe the most unprecedented violence in history because Jews are in power and want to destroy all other nations. If punishing the Jews for their increased visibility was not allowed during the 1920s and 30s, under the Germans it was. When in the fall of 1941, a group of Ukrainian men carried out a pogrom in downtown Kiev, robbing and murdering a number of Jewish residents of the city who they buried alive, one of them later explained why he betrayed a Soviet Jewish POW who had served at the front as a military doctor. He turned him in to the Germans. He justified his actions by referring to his desire to punish the Jews for their support of the Soviet government. They drank the blood of my daughter, who was arrested by the NKVD in 1939. Now let others drink theirs, he said. Perceived as the prime beneficiaries of the Soviet regime, Jews were held accountable of Stalin's crimes. Let me now return to Yitzhak Erlichson, the young Polish Jew in evacuation, who narrates his first encounter with the widespread stereotype that Jews evaded the war effort, were unable or unwilling to engage in combat, that while Russians fought heroically at the front, Jews fled to Tashkent or hid in hospitals and eventually managed to receive the status of invalids and collect a pension they did not deserve. Although we do not know how many young Soviet Jews volunteered to join the Red Army precisely to dispel this lie and demonstrate their courage and patriotism. It was 1942 when Yitzhak Erlichson was traveling by train toward Kuibyshev when he noticed a heated confrontation between two Russian officers and a Jewish soldier who was wounded. He had been wounded at the front. The two officers apparently accused Jews of being cowards and refused to fight during the war. And when the soldiers protested loudly and vigorously, this had to do with his identity as a fighter and as a Jew, I would say. The two officers threw him off the train, killing him. In utter shock, Erlichson attempted to report the crime to local authorities in Kuibyshev, but he was met with silence. Quote, the chief of police checked the officers' papers and said that he could do nothing. They were traveling to the front and he had no power to stop them. I asked if there was no punishment for such savage murderers. Couldn't they report them to a higher authority? But my words were for naught. The chief of police let the criminals go free and began to check my documents. The chief of police was probably in agreement with the Russian officers. Moreover, the crime was a trivial matter that could be brushed aside against the backdrop of the momentous war effort. Rising anti-Semitism triggered an emotional response among Jews who had grown accustomed to a system that rejected, albeit not perfectly, anti-Semitism. They became very sensitive about anti-Jewish stereotypes and by being excluded by the collective war experience and effort. Soldiers and sometimes their families resorted to the written word to counter anti-Jewish stereotypes, pleading with the authorities. In one such case, in the summer of 1942, it was a group of 20 Jewish women, wives of Red Army military personnel in Soviet Kyrgyzia, who protested anti-Semitism, writing directly to Stalin. And they wrote, quote, during the days of the Great Patriotic War, when all people should be always united and engaged in a common effort to strengthen the rear and help the front, here in our cities, we observe and experience in person terrible medieval anti-Semitism. Accusations that Jews are killing children of other nations, drinking their blood, and using their body parts to make soup. Well, we do know that the women managed to get the attention of the authorities since their letter to Stalin was followed by an investigation. It is doubtful that this entailed any kind of consequence for those who made the accusation. And it is precisely the silence, the indifference on the part of the authorities who turned their back to anti-Semitism, which was no longer considered an expression of anti-Soviet behavior, that led some veterans to take the law into their own hands. This happened in the fall of 1945 in Kiev, a city that was self-destroyed, that lacked food, other essentials. Its residents faced skyrocketing prices on the black market. And on one afternoon of September 4th, 1945, Lieutenant Yosef Rosenstein, a Jewish senior radio operator at the front, was on his way back home from the bread store when he was attacked by two servicemen. First, they confronted him with the slur of Tashkent partisan, implying that instead of fighting at the front, he had enjoyed evacuation. Then they physically attacked him. In retaliation, the lieutenant sought revenge. In a desperate, emotional, impulsive attempt to dispel assumptions of cowardice and disloyalty, wearing his uniform for semblance of legality, he shot and killed both men. This action sparked instant unrest in the city. A large crowd gathered around the dead bodies and attacked the lieutenant's wife and a Jewish man passing by who were severely injured. The next day, the servicemen's funeral further ignited ethnic tensions as the procession quickly turned into a pogrom. It began with anti-Semitic slogans chanted through the city streets and eventually deteriorated into violence against Jews. 36 of the 100 victims in the attacks were hospitalized and 5 were murdered. But Lieutenant Rosenstein was arrested shortly after the events, and on October 1st, 1945, the military tribunal sentenced him to death. And I'm going to close with one last instance that I want to discuss. It was these events in Kiev that shocked 4 Jewish war veterans who had fought at the front and who decided to write a letter addressed to Stalin, a passionate one, to Stalin and also to the NKVD chairman, Lavrentiy Beria. They complained about the abnormal political atmosphere in their city, where anti-Semitism reigned. They protested, quote, "Beat the Yeeds," the favorite slogan of German fascists, Ukrainian nationalists, and the Tsar's Black Hundreds is heard through the streets of the capital of Ukraine, in trams, trolley buses, stores, the marketplace, and even in some Soviet institutions. End quote. The war veterans voiced their dismay, hinting at the collapse of one of the founding myths of Soviet Jewry, namely the absence of pogroms. Quote, "It is a disgrace for our party and our socialist motherland that a Jewish pogrom occurred here in Kiev under the Soviets after our victory over German fascism. It will be written in the history of our revolution that the first Jewish pogrom since the collapse of Tsarism occurred on the 28th year since the October Revolution," end quote. This is a long letter, and it was above all an attack on local authorities. The petitioners identified them as chiefly responsible for the context that led to the violence, which could result, they feared, in a pogrom of even greater magnitude, one worthy of Hitler and Goebbels, they wrote. They also criticized the party for failing to publicly acknowledge that thousands of Jews died as heroes defending the motherland. The party also kept silent, they argued, about the fact that no other people had experienced as much terror and grief as the Jewish people during the Great Patriotic War. In a way, they're singling out the Jewish experience from the collective war experience. According to the veterans, Rosenstein's decision to kill the 2 servicemen who attacked him grew out of the local authorities' indifference to the plight of the Jews. The war veterans attempted to alert Stalin and Beria about the harmful impact that these policies had on Jews themselves, while some Jewish communists stormed the city party organizations, tore up their party membership card and threw it on the floor in protest. Others attempted to flee Ukraine for Poland or America in search of a place with no anti-Semitism, argued the war veterans. And Jewish pioneers and members of the Komsomol who had never experienced their Jewishness before suddenly experienced a national reawakening because of the hatred of other children. But the times had changed. In the post-war years, central authorities did not rebuke local authorities for ignoring the official Soviet policy on anti-Semitism. The 4 Jewish veterans who had appealed to Moscow to intervene and counter anti-Semitism in what they called their beautiful Ukrainian republic were punished. The letter was conveyed to Khrushchev on October 12, 1945, and the 4 men were arrested, accused of bourgeois nationalism, and executed shortly thereafter. The signals from above given by central authorities were now perfectly synchronized with the popular opinion that emerged from below. With the post-World War II reversal of the Bolshevik emancipation project, the notion of Soviet universalism and brotherhood of peoples seemed to reject the Jews by writing them out of the new myth of the Great Patriotic War. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Elissa. Thank you to the presenters. Again, I invite everyone to submit their questions through the Q&A box. But in the meantime, I have several questions of my own. And so my first questions are both to Marilyn and to Maxim. And, well, I actually have two. So the first one is that the theme of this panel is soldiers through cultural lens. But what you depict is not just cultural, but also documentary responses and documentary lenses. So my question is, well, what exactly for you is the line between documentary like photographs and cultural in terms of motivations of people who produced those works? Did they see it as documentary or cultural? For Maxim, well, so you talked quite a bit about reactions to the staging of the trial and the policies from above. I want to ask you about the anti-Semitism from below that Elissa just described, and how that figure or did not figure into what you saw in poetry or in reactions to the Krasnodar trial. And to Elissa, well, since again our theme is cultural lens, well, what are the cultural responses to the things that you just described, especially the pogrom in Kiev among the Soviet veterans that you saw? I don't know if you looked at that, but if you could say something, that would be great. So, who wants to go first?
I could. It seems I had the first question.
Sure.
Okay. So yeah, I think it's very interesting that in your question you seem to separate art and documentation, and taking the example of photograph, and that's very productive, because my work has shown that in the Soviet case, we cannot come with this assumption that a photograph is this thing that documents and that is like objective, because everything was art. And that's why in my work, like I look at drawings, I look at photographs, and all of that serves a purpose. You know, they were sending those artists not because they didn't have this opportunity to document, and they didn't have cameras. It's because both were important and when we're serving a purpose. So I think, to answer your question, this cultural lens is present even when they do documentation, because they believed, like both artists and, you know, the union that were sending them to the front, they believed that they had to have the two together, that they had, that there was value in having the eye of the input and the eye of the artist and of the photographer. And that's why photo manipulation and all of that was accepted and part of the process. So yeah, I think it goes back to this objectivity versus like interpretation. And I think that both were value and were not seen in contradiction. I hope it answers your question.
Thank you. So Maxim?
Well, to be quite frank, the panel chose me, so I'm not entirely sure how to answer the question about the cultural lens. I think it's because it's an interdisciplinary topic that it sort of fell into this panel. So I'm not prepared to debate whether it belongs here or not. It probably does, but for reasons that it has to do with the paradox, or one of the paradoxes of the representation and coverage of both the Shoah and of Jewish military value, is that a lion's share of coverage was done by Jewish writers, many of whom became frontline reporters and political officers, some quite famous and others rank and file, who served on the same division on army newspaper with one promotion between 41 and 45 and no glory. And then, of course, very famous writers who were not frontline, but civilian reporters who traveled embedded with the troops or reported. This is part of the larger picture of my research. And so whether it's documentary or not, of course, the example of Sylvinsky proves it to be documentary, because he wrote a poem in place of filing essays that he was supposed to as a frontline journalist. And he filed a number of poems, some of which became some of the earliest texts from which the population, the annihilation of Jews by Nazis, what we now call the Shoah. So that's, I guess, Evgeny, the first part of your question. I believe you also asked how this connects with the question of anti-Semitism.
From below.
And to answer this question briefly, I guess I will say this. From the very beginning, when the trial was being put together, the orchestrators were very careful not to overtly represent Jewish victimhood. If you saw the transcript of the Krasnodar trial, the word Jew appears only once, and in the most bizarre context, when a certain member of the medical personnel says that the Gestapo came and says, "Do you have Jews?" And we said, "We have none." So you can imagine the challenges of reporting on a trial like that and of representing that what happened exactly under the circumstances. It is astounding today. And lastly, and that's, I guess, the bigger picture answer, just like it was becoming next to impossible for Jewish writers, journalists, to write Jewishly of Jewish victimhood and to bury the Jews according to the Jewish rites, it was also becoming impossible for Jewish writers, say Sylvinsky, to write Jewishly about the accused, about Nazis and their collaborators. And the fact that Sylvinsky was being pressured by a panel of Russian writers, some of them leading writers like Nikolai Tikhonov, not to include the execution scene, to me indicates that they no longer wanted Jews to be sitting in judgment of Russian collaborators and to be writing about the execution of those collaborators. That's my bigger picture answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Lisa?
Okay, thank you, Evgeny, for the question. Let me begin by saying that, one of the problems with, for example, the letter that I discussed at the end of my presentation was the fact that the Jewish war veterans were criticizing the party and criticizing the system for not addressing the question of anti-Semitism. That was the problem number one. And then you have also the problem, of kind of saying out loud to Stalin that Jews deserve to have, to have their role, their heroic role and their tragic role acknowledged in the narrative of the war. The other problem is that basically they're comparing the Nazi system to the Soviet system in this letter, which is a very long letter. But discussing anti-Semitism openly was not really possible. I talked about this alignment between forces from above and forces from below. It means that the forces from above will not tolerate that, and at the local level, at the regional level, authorities are reading this message very clearly. In terms of Jewish or even Yiddish language culture that might have been able to express this, criticize anti-Semitism, it was really close to impossible. And I guess as an example, as a parallel, I can mention the fact that discussing at this early period of time, 1945, discussing even Jewish pride was considered criminal. If we think about the writer Kipnis, who he was almost arrested and who at some point even argued the Jewish soldiers should be wearing a Magen David, right, a Jewish star, because of what they have accomplished during the war. There are no Jewish culture institutions in Kiev. There's no newspaper published in Yiddish where one could. My point is where one could find some expressions of criticism against anti-Semitism. And the letters, of course, that were sent to Ilya Ehrenburg, that Mordechai Altshuler has collected, or in the new book by Arkady Zeltser, which is a wonderful book in which he has translated not only letters to Ehrenburg, but also to Michoels and to other Jewish leaders. We get a sense of that. What do we do with this new anti-Semitism? What is our role in society? Where do we fit in? And this, this ties in with the excellent remarks that Zvi Gittelman made in earlier about, you know, what it meant to confront the war and what it meant to confront the Holocaust, but also what it meant to confront anti-Semitism. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you. So we have a question in the Q&A box, and that's, Elissa, that's for you. Could you please comment on the use of Cold War memoirs as a source? And I think here the question is more specifically about Erlickson's memoir and all the possible biases and exaggerations that might have been included there. So what's your take on that?
Evgeny, can you repeat the question? I couldn't hear anything.
Sorry. So the question was, could you please talk a bit about the use of Cold War memoirs as a source? And it was more specifically about Erlickson's memoir and possible biases and exaggerations that might have been there, though not the general theme or the conclusions of it.
That's an excellent question. I mean, yeah, the memoirs were first published in Yiddish in 1953, and they are now available in English with a wonderful translation, and I believe published by academic press. But anyway, it doesn't matter. So, you know, we have to use a grain of salt when we approach these memoirs. Of course, there is a lot of resentment that he expressed later against the Soviet Union in general, ideologically, but also from a vantage point of Soviet citizens and how they responded to anti-Semitism. But I think that, you know, we can still use these memoirs carefully and discuss them vis-a-vis, other sources, because I don't think that what he is saying in any way, counters the narrative that I'm suggesting here, that I think that most of us agree with. We just have to be careful.
Thank you. And actually, another question to Maxim. So at the end of your presentation, you said that Sylvinsky's poem cannot be found on the internet. And why do you think this is the case? Because to me, it's quite a puzzle. So any ideas?
That makes two of us, or maybe that makes three of us, you, me, and the person who asked the question. Honestly, I do not have a rational answer, because the 1947 edition with Krym, Kavkaz, Kuban, which is a large compendium of Sylvinsky's wartime longer and shorter poems, which, by the way, included some of his key texts. Я это видел, I saw it, about the Shoah, included Sud v Krasnodaре, the trial at Krasnodar. It's available in major libraries, and it can easily be obtained. So I think a rational explanation does not help. And in other words, a rational explanation that posits that anything that is accessible will find its way to the Russian internet. And then we have to account for some of the mysteries of the poem's legacy. I think probably the biggest part here is it's a very controversial poem, as I hope I made clear, and as I hope to make clear in some of the other things I'm working on in this connection. I think it rubs a lot of readers the wrong way still today. Now, that would be my principal explanation, because certainly there is no dearth of other texts by Sylvinsky, including his principal Holocaust as I saw it, Я это видел, Kerch, the longer meditative poem that he also writes in 1942, and then of course his long poem Kandava, which is about confrontation between a Jewish officer and a Nazi officer who has a decoration from the Crimean campaign, etc., etc. Basically, let me sum it up by saying this. I have examined a number of archival possibilities. On the side of Sylvinsky, his entire archive, then the Znamya archive, which is absolutely invaluable because you can understand how decisions were made, what the editors disputed, and particularly how they really did not want the execution scene there. But there are a couple of archives which deal with the Krasnodar trial that are not accessible, and perhaps some answers are there, so we live in hope.
Thank you. And there is a general question, I assume it's to everyone, about Jewish memoirs published in the Soviet Union when Stalin was alive. So I know that those existed, but how extensive were those? And if anyone has any experience working with those sources in terms of language, focus here, so anything you can say about that would be great. Thank you.
I didn't understand the question.
So the question was more generally about Jewish memoirs published in the Soviet Union when Stalin was still alive. The person asking the question is under the impression that what was allowed was just the official publication rather than private reflections. So for those of you who work with those memoirs, any reflections on those would be great. Thank you. But please be short because we have just 2 minutes left.
Maxim, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say, I think it's a misconception because up until 1946, the late fall, the thick journals were still publishing out of inertia. The materials they had accepted in early 1946, late 45, and those included memoirs by Jewish members of the Red Army and materials about the Shoah. And then basically around October 1946, they pretty much stopped. But the window is pretty wide, 1944 till the fall of 1946. So a number of things did come out.
And you are talking about Russian language memoirs?
Russian language, yes.
Okay, thank you. So I guess we're out of time, so I will pass the stage to Michael. Michael.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for being part of this. This was a wonderful session. There was a question about recordings. I just want all of our attendees to know that the recordings will be made available in the coming days, and we will circulate those links to you. We are now going to conclude this session, and we will enter into our final session for the day. So we do hope that you'll join us for what will be a wonderful special program that will start in just a moment. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.